Welcome. We're honored to have you listen and participate in these dialogues produced by the Cora de Brazza Foundation. To learn more about the Foundation and about how you can help us in our mission of unearthing untold stories of moral energy, please visit us at virtuesofpeace.com. There you can access show archives, show resources, visit our Etsy shop, and support us with a donation. virtuesofpeace.com.
Hello and welcome to Virtues of Peace. My name is Hope Elizabeth May and I'm joined by Michael Buzzy.
Hello everyone. Thank you so much for having me.
I am overjoyed that you are here today, Michael, because today is a very, very important day. I know you know what today is, Michael, so why don't you fill the audience in as to what the significance of today is?
Today is May 18th, which 125 years ago marked the beginning of the Hague Peace Conference and has from that time on was known as International Peace Day pre-World War I and obviously then World War II as well.
Well said. Indeed, today is Peace Day, and the Hague Peace Conference to which Michael is referring is the 1899 one, because there was a 1907 one as well. And the 1899 Hague Peace Conference is really foundational to all of our dialogues. We revived the Virtues of Peace podcast. Actually, it was the Ethics Talk podcast, and we rebranded the podcast as Virtues of Peace on May 18th, 2020. So this is also the 4-year anniversary of this show. We took a bit of a pause in 2023, but we have been slowly getting back to speed, recording these conversations that, in our view, need to be had. These stories need to get out. And so we're here on Peace Day, and I would also be remiss if I didn't mention that this today is also a day of profound, shall we say, grieving, but also possibly joy, because it is the May 18th Gwangju massacre in Korea. We mentioned this the last May 18th show that we did, which was in 2022. We missed May 18th, 2023. But here we are, 2024. And what are we doing today? We are continuing a conversation that we had on April 21st of this year. Check out that archive at our show page, virtuesofpeace.com. And in that show, we had a special guest, and that is British historian Elizabeth Crawford. And she spoke in that show about her research on the last will and testament of Nurse Catherine Pine, who was born in 1864, died in 1941. And in that show of April 21st, we focused on this specific provision of Nurse Catherine Pine's last will and testament. And you can read Nurse Pine's last will and testament at our show resources page. I think I put it on our show resources page for this week. If not, it's on the April 21st show resources page. Now, that provision that we focused on, which I'm going to call the suffragette memorabilia provision, because Nurse Pine's will is about a page long. It was excavated and read and reported on by Elizabeth Crawford. In the 1990s, she excavated and read it. She reported on it in 1999 in her book, The Woman's Suffrage Movement, a Reference Guide, 1866 to 1928, and also on her blog, Woman and Her Sphere, blog post of May 26, 2016, titled The Mystery of Nurse Pine's Medal. Read it. It's on our show resources page. So Nurse Pine's will is about a page, and there's a provision called the suffragette memorabilia provision, which we are focusing on. We focused on that last week, the part that speaks about her, quote, suffragette medal, but we're going to focus on this different part today. And I'm going to just read this provision, what I'm calling the suffragette memorabilia provision of Nurse Catherine Pine's will. So here it comes. Here is the provision. She says, quote, "My suffrage books and photographs pertaining to the Votes for Women campaign to the Women's Social and Political Club if they want these. Period. My suffragette medal to be sent to the history section of the British College of Nursing from Sister C.E. Pine, St. Bart's Hospital, London. Period. End of provision." We are focused on the first sentence in this show. That is, my suffrage books and photographs pertaining to the Votes for Women campaign to the Women's Social and Political Club if they want these. So as we discussed last time in that podcast of April 21st, Nurse Catherine Pine, in her last will and testament, divides her suffrage memorabilia and she bequeaths it to two different entities, the Women's Social and Political Club on the one hand, and the history section of the British College of Nurses on the other. And last week, when we were discussing with Elizabeth this provision, from Elizabeth, I learned, I never appreciated until our conversation last week, that the Women's Social and Political Club is actually something called the Suffragette Fellowship Club, which became, we'll talk about it, but this phrase Suffragette Fellowship is sort of like a phrase, a vocab item that you should stick in your hat. Suffragette Fellowship, but also the Suffragette Club. According to Elizabeth, the Women's Social and Political Club was in fact this suffragette club. And we're going to be talking about what that is because Michael, who's with me, has been in the archives of the Suffragette Fellowship Club, now called Collection. And this is a really amazing thing, actually. And so that's what we're talking about. Anything you want to add to this, Michael, before I continue?
Very excited to recollect and look back on our time digging through the collection. Just a sheer plethora of incredibly impactful pieces of information. And I think it just speaks to the power of their collective efforts to still impact our own thinking and actions within the 21st century.
Yes. And I'm pretty sure that actually and as you know, there's really not enough years in the life. Michael and I'm getting a bit ahead of myself and we'll loop back to this, but when Michael's talking about like being in the collection, he's talking about being in, I don't know if you've heard of it, microfilm. And microfilm. And we had to use microfilm readers. And the Suffragette Fellowship Collection, as we said in our April 21st show, is on microfilm. It was put onto microfilm, and oh my God, like so many years ago, decades ago, 1985, so long ago before Michael's time. Somebody in 1985 said, we must put this on microfilm. And I read a sentence that it's not all of the collection that's on microfilm. Only some of the collection is on microfilm. And it's 14 reels of microfilm. 14 reels. And to go through one reel, wow. I mean, it depends what's in it, but what would you say, Michael? I mean, to go through one reel of microfilm, to really go through it and really process it. How many, weeks, months, hours? What do you want to give a guess here?
Oh my goodness. It's truly countless hours. I mean, there's a good number of pieces on each there's 14 of them, as you had said, and then there's a number of individual pieces that capture documents or passages or parts of autobiographies or last wills and testaments, correspondence between them. And you really get a sense of what it is like to go through this excavation process, especially from someone like myself, I very much prefer to sit and to read and digest very slowly. And so it would be quite jarring when you would say read maybe a max of 7 individual pieces of information in one film, and you notice that an hour and a half has passed. And if there's, say, 70 items on that film, and then you have 14 of them that are at least the same size or maybe a little bit larger, it really gives you an idea of how much time and intentionality it takes to sit and to go through them. But I mean, that's also part, I would say, of the joy of doing that work is you're stuck on those 7 because what you're reading is incredibly captivating, and you almost feel privileged to be able to go through a process like this, and you want to do it justice, which requires a lot of time and intentionality, but it's also then very joyful, and that's why you find yourself going through it incredibly slowly because they're such meaty morsels and you want to take your time digesting them.
Indeed. And this is such a valuable, shall we say, side conversation, just the art of, researching and like outside of the internet. Because just yesterday, actually, my husband was watching, God help him, CNN, and there was, or MSNBC, one of them, and there was a report on how Gen Z is more prone to misinformation than any other generation. And that sort of piqued my interest because I'm interested in misinformation, because I think that we're living not just in like misinformation disseminated from AI and the internet, but the erasure of narratives. When we're taught history, if we're only exposed to certain narratives, we're very misinformed about what actually happened. And so the misinformation campaign was well in existence before the internet, and now it's just gotten worse. But anyway, I listened to this report on whatever channel it was, and I turned to my husband and I said, this is why, archival research is so important. It's why primary sources are so important, because, they're not going to, but you've got to like get out the microfilm and you get into like a different type of research. And it is a kind of World Wide Web, but in the microfilm. It's a much more narrow thing, and it's not on the internet, which makes it perhaps more interesting and mysterious, and this, like, I can't Google this. There's some like intrigue behind it. And so I think there's a whole aura behind primary source research, going into archives, going into microfilms. And let's hope that, with all due respect to Adobe, who makes very valuable pieces of software, but they are taking over libraries, and they're taking over the space in the library at Central Michigan University, so that they can sell their pieces of software. And what's happening, I'm afraid that our microfilm readers will be eliminated, because who uses them but you and I? I've seen a couple. I've seen like maybe some history students using them, but I mean, in any case, let's hope that the microfilm machines stay, and let's mark this conversation for arguments why they are important for young persons such as yourself, Michael.
Absolutely.
All right. So anyway, there is this microfilm, 14 reels, but let's go back to like this provision of Pine's will, which says, okay, I want to leave my suffrage books and photographs pertaining to the Votes for Women campaign to the Women's Social and Political Club. Now, according to Elizabeth Crawford, that entity to which she is referring is the Suffragette Fellowship Club, or sometimes called the Suffragette Club. And what was that? That's our question. What was that? And Elizabeth said last time that Suffragette Club, that's how it began. It began as a club, and then it became this Suffragette Fellowship, out of which the Suffragette Fellowship collection grew. So here's the developmental line, if you will. You have this Suffragette Club. Nurse Pine refers to it as the Women's Social and Political Club. You have the Suffragette Club. It then becomes this Suffragette Fellowship Collection, and then the Suffragette Fellowship Club. They at some point adopt this Suffragette Fellowship vocab. And I should also say that if you're interested in more about the Suffragette Fellowship, Elizabeth Crawford, in her amazing contribution of 1999 called The Women's Suffrage Movement, a Reference Guide, 1866 to 1928, just do yourself a favor and buy a copy. I mean, just like, it is just a treasure trove of, like, just do yourself a favor. Just trust me on this one. She has an entry in there called the Suffragette Fellowship, and you can learn a lot of things. So I'm just going to give you a quick timeline that I'm getting from Elizabeth's entry. So, and we're going to talk really about the first one in detail, but you have in February 1926, the quote, Suffragette Club is formed. So that's 1926 February. You have this thing called the Suffragette Club. And again, Nurse Pine dies in 1941, and she leaves her thing to what she calls the Women's Social and Political Club. It's interesting that she doesn't use the phrase suffragette. It's very interesting to me that she doesn't use that phrase, and we'll talk about vocab a little bit later. According to Elizabeth's entry on the Suffragette Fellowship, in 1933, the effort is made to create some archives, or like a space to hold archives, because as we'll see when we get to this founding document of 1926, it was like, okay, let's form a club, but then, as we'll see, we need to find a place to store all of our relics, our banners and flags, and all of this stuff from the movement. And so in 1933, they start to store this, what we would call today, material culture, in the houses of these women. So the house of Geraldine Lennox is used in 1933. Then it moves to the house of Mary Phillips. And then they find a record room at something called the Minerva Club, which deserves its own podcast, by the way. And so maybe we'll do a podcast on the Minerva Club. So cool. What a cool space. A woman's record room is created at the Minerva Club in 1937. And then in 1939, this women's record room is moved to a place in Westminster, which is part of London. And then you have, 1939, important date because that's when World War II begins in Europe. Yeah, I know some of my students don't know about Pearl Harbor. They don't know what I mean when I say Pearl Harbor. That is the truth, guys. That is the truth. So we enter World War II in 1941, but in any case, it begins in Europe in 1939, and so they move the women's record room. And then it's moved after World War II to the Suffragette Museum in London. And then in 1951, the London Museum takes over the collection. So again, all of this history is in detail in Elizabeth Crawford's entry on the Suffragette Fellowship in her reference guide. And there was a newsletter, and this club continued to publish their newsletter and erect monuments at least until the 70s. I don't know what's happening with the Suffragette Fellowship today. There's no Wikipedia page on it, and we are damn Yankees in the United States, and we would like to know a bit more about this entity. And so we're here doing our part. But there's the newsletter, and we have on our show resources page. The newsletter was called "Calling All Women," and on our show resources page there is an issue of that newsletter that you can read for yourself. And so the line is 1926 to at least the 1970s, and then in 1985 we have the microfilming that we've been talking about of the Suffragette Fellowship collection. So, Michael, do you want to add anything or sum anything up that I didn't do well? before we move on?
I think you did. The timeline, the history, excellent. I would say to kind of draw a parallel between them storing the physicality of their archive and their items, and then to kind of draw a parallel to the physicality of the microfilms. That, as you had said earlier, there's this almost mystery about them and intrigue in that, like you said, you cannot find this information. You can't Google it. You can't Google or search on the films themselves. You have to go through, be very intentional to delineate and distill what you're looking for. And I think that physical act which differs so greatly from our present time of scrolling and you're just bombarded, as a person of the Gen Z generation, I understand my peers and I's plight with this, that you're just constantly bombarded with quick, easy information, and the intentionality and the different physicality, the actual motions you have of going through the films, of sitting there scrolling. They're generally in black and white, so you're not being bombarded with various sights and sounds and flashing lights. You have to work hard to get yourself into a state of, I know the term flow has been used before, where you can be receptive to the information that you're receiving. And I think that intentionality that it requires is in many ways what they are hoping to mirror in storing their physical collection for individuals to then go through. Because that's its own process that requires intentionality and physicality to dig through various items to even get an idea of what you're looking for or even what you're looking at.
That's really cool. And I would add to that, and so there's this intentional, as different type of physical behavior, from clicking on a screen or clicking on a line on a screen, through to, I should say, digesting a reel. That's REEL, not REAL. A reel on a microfilm. And you have to learn how to use a machine. And there's an investment and what we would call transaction costs. You have to get the microfilm, and then you have to learn how to use the machine, and then you have to sit there. And it's a totally different physical experience. But the other thing I want to say about the microfilm, and why it's so important, and why it's important in the same way as you said about like this collection, this museum. And this is a point made by Hannah Arendt that has not been lost on me. I think it's such an important point. The importance of appearing to the conscience, to the consciousness. And, without the microfilm and without the material culture, this is just our conscience is not impacted at all by this nest of stories, if you will, and the more important thing, the moral energy that is within them. And so there needs to be like a vehicle through which they, quote, appear to the conscience. And now, I believe there was just a book published, maybe even this month, about the Suffragette Fellowship. I don't have it. It's $200, yet another transaction cost. But there's there's books. But the type of person who's going to buy $200 and sit down with a book just on the Suffragette Fellowship, there's like a different type of investment from, interacting with, just like, I know you got into Kitty Marion, who's in the Suffragette Fellowship collection. There's just it's just a different way to quote, and this is the vocabulary that I use, enter the forest. We can enter the forest of an untold story through a book that costs $200, or we can enter the forest through an untold story through an artifact or a reel on a microfilm. So, and so I think, like the museum, if you will, it's not like, I don't know when microfilm readers were invented. I imagine after 1951. I don't know. Interesting question. But like before, the microfilm was like, how did you transmit this stuff? Like there's books and there's like relics. And relics tell stories. Of course, if the storyteller is right. You have to have the right storyteller. But right, they're like these are this museum and these relics are a way of transmitting the morally energetic narrative. And part of that involves appearing to the conscience, or if you like, the public conscience. Okay. So I'll stop there and see if you want to add anything.
Really, it struck a chord with me when you had used the word investment, because that is also what had come to mind in the remarks that you were giving, in that what the suffragettes are doing by storing their physical material is in a way making an investment in the knowledge base of those in the future. That this is something that they can go to and learn about the past, and more importantly about a positive past, instead of, say, the very more easily accessible narratives of national glory through monuments to leaders in battle or leaders in a high political office, who then also generally tend to be men. So it's an investment in getting out a narrative that can greatly change and impact the way in which one views the world. In particular, it may even view then their own agency of what is possible, as you may find something that you then relate to something of someone in the past, and that even though they're no longer alive, that can be a very powerful and empowering knowledge base to have. And then the investment that then one makes in themselves by going to then gain an understanding by engaging with those archives, that through the investment made by the suffragettes in the future, you are then impacted by that and then have the opportunity, should you feel so inclined, to make the investment within yourself. But then again, that requires intentionality, because as you had said, it takes a particular person to buy a $200 book on the suffragette movement and to sit down, or to go out and seek the archives or the microfilms to gain that knowledge base. Because as an individual in his early 20s, if it was not through Hope's efforts within researching this history, it was certainly something that was not easily accessible to me or taught to me even at any other point in my life. So, and I can speak from personal experience, having come to be impacted by this history. It greatly does change your worldview and the way in which you operate as just a person making your way through life itself.
Cool. And exactly how old are you, Michael?
23 years old now. So my first interaction with the Suffragette Fellowship Collection was in February of 2022. So a little over 2 years ago. And at that time I was 20, because it was early February. My birthday's in February. So I had not yet turned 21. So yeah, and I can definitely say that the history is one that has continued to resonate within me. As I had said, it took me intentional, slow digestion of the films I was coming across, but you take pictures of them and you save them. And there are certainly times when I've gone back to, say, pages from Kitty Marion's unpublished autobiography that she was writing in 1930, and you read those and you go to them in your times of need. They give you uplift. And that is probably one of the most incredible aspects of doing research like this, is that these people and their ideas and their work remains alive within you. And so then what is your duty to pass on, which you have known? So that's one of the most incredible aspects of it for me personally.
That's beautifully put. And my name is Hope, and it gives me hope, actually. And like on this investment piece, so really, like, well, I'll just cut to the chase, like nobody has made this investment in this transmission of memory as women have. And that's, we're going to be talking about that. But I mean, we came here because Nurse Pine's last will and testament, to remind you all, when she dies, she leaves her books and photographs to this collection, the Suffragette Fellowship, and she leaves her suffragette medal to the History College of Nurses. And so she's like investing, we'll talk about, she invests while she's living, but also on her death. And then there's a conscious decision in 1926 of one specific person to be like, we need to get together and reminisce, and we need to like find a place for these relics. It's really like one person. So we're saying like them, like other people agree and they start to contribute. But it's really this person named Edith Howe Martin, and Martin is spelled with a Y. I've looked at the Wikipedia page. Someone needs to correct it because I see a couple of, Martin with an I. So there's work that needs to be done. But Edith Howe, How, Martin with a Y. It's really her idea. Well, no one does it alone, but it's her document that we have here. It's on the show resources page. It's right from Reel 2, frames 78 and 79 from the microfilm of the Suffragette Fellowship Collection. We have put it on our show resources page. It's really cool. This is a document. You're talking about, Michael, going back to documents. And I go back to this document a lot because she's talking about a spirit in this document. And I'm just going to read the first sentence. It's because it's so interesting to me. This is the primary source document of her handwritten. This is not typed. It's handwritten. And she says, the Suffragette Club is intended to enshrine and she began writing suffragette spirit, but she crosses out suffragette. So the Suffragette Club is intended to enshrine the spirit, which was evoked in the hearts and minds of thousands of women by the ideals and demands of the militant movement. Okay, that's a word that needs to be digested. We need to digest suffragette. I'm going to read it again. The Suffragette Club is intended to enshrine the spirit, which was evoked in the hearts and minds of thousands of women by the ideals and demands of the militant movement. A call to win by their own deeds the political enfranchisement of women, period. And she goes on to talk about the suffragette spirit, a spirit of joyful sacrifice. It is a very real thing, so on and so forth. Now, we're going to talk about that spirit in a moment, but let's just get clear on some vocab now. So, Michael, I believe you understand the difference between suffragist and suffragette. Is that a safe assumption? Can you explain the difference, please?
For sure. So the suffragette term indicates those women. It indicates those women and their assisters, which sometimes included men, which we may get to, and then evokes the history of the women's movement in the United Kingdom. That's the suffragette term indicator. Suffragist is the term used to indicate women, their supporters in the history surrounding women enfranchisement within the United States. So suffragist is the United States and suffragette is the United Kingdom.
Cool. And I'm going to add to that a little bit. And what's the main? So we have are there a difference in their ways of going about getting the right to vote from the United Kingdom on the one hand to the U.S. on the other?
Absolutely. One big key difference was the suffragettes, so the UK, were far more militant in their tactics, primarily engaging not in destructive acts against persons, but destructive acts against property, particularly public property. The idea being behind, you act against public property in destructive ways, you then directly hit the state, which is the entity barring you from being enfranchised. And hitting the state in a way which induces a need to financially react, pay for the damage, and so forth. That is seen as more antagonistic and more likely to evoke a response, which was their tactic. The suffragists So the women activists in the United States did not undergo property destruction.
That's correct. Now, actually, there were attacks on private property in the United Kingdom. So at the summer home of Lloyd George, for instance, there was explosives put there and so forth. So it's not just public property. And the other nuance that I did not sufficiently appreciate until doing the nitty-gritty work that I'm called to do, if you will, because to understand the Suffragette Club and Edith Howe Martin, and like, what is this? You have to understand that even within the militant, you use this, and I think it's such an unfortunate label. And I said this when we were talking with Elizabeth Crawford a few weeks ago, that, that phrase militant evokes like military, physical violence. It's such an unfortunate adjective. It's really quite misleading. I mean, maybe like coercion or aggression or hardball would be more fitting. But so this phrase militant, Michael correctly said, like, there was never any position to inflict physical violence onto people in order to, quote, achieve social justice, which, I mean, there are views out there that, like, in order to realize social justice, I can commit acts of violence and like use guns and so forth. This was not the position. This was, quote, violence against property, and they called this militant. But so there was the Women's Social and Political Union, which was like the big dog, if you will, in the UK movement. But there was another breakaway. This entity actually broke away. So these women were part of the Women's Social and Political Union, which began, like with these more aggressive hardball tactics, which involve things like rushing the House of Commons, not property destruction. Like the whole property destruction thing and arson and explosives, that was like too radical for some people. And so they broke away from the Women's Social and Political Union, and they formed something called the Women's Freedom League. And there are other political problems that these women had with the Women's Social and Political Union. And I'm learning all of this from Elizabeth Crawford's excellent research guide. So again, like, she has an entry on the Women's Freedom League. I highly recommend it. Just buy the book, please. But according to that, so you have like this disagreement about how militant is militant. Like, is it like arson and explosives, or is it just hardball in terms of heckling parliamentarians? How militant is militant? So there was disagreement on this. And the other reason why these women broke away is because the whole like leadership philosophy of the Women's Social and Political Union became somewhat dictatorial, where Emmeline Pankhurst, and you'll appreciate this, Michael, because you studied political science, but it was like at some point, I think it was 1907, you have this breakaway movement. This was done because Emmeline Pankhurst was like, look, what's going to happen now is that I'm going to appoint myself who's in like the executive board, and it's not going to be a democratically elected thing. I'm basically the generalissimo, and I'm appointing who, like, the leadership. And people didn't like that, and they also didn't like, so interesting, the position of, we support no candidate. Like, this was picked up by Alice Paul with the National Woman's Party. You see, like, when you have the National Woman's Party, it doesn't say Democrat or Republican. It's just National Woman's Party, meaning we're not going to cooperate with any party, even if you are, quote, progressive. We're not going to cooperate with any party that doesn't put women's enfranchisement at the forefront. We're just done with you. And the women in the Women's Freedom League, they sort of like went back and forth on this. They thought it was a little bit too much, like at least support the Labour Party. Like they went back and forth. Again, read Elizabeth's entry if you want the nitty gritty. But there were these, political disagreements that these women had, and so they broke away and they formed this thing called the Women's Freedom League. And the person who created the Suffragette Club, Edith Howe Martin, again spelled with a Y, not an I, she was a part of this breakaway group. She was a member of the Women's Freedom League. All right. So I'll stop there and see if, Michael, you have any comments, questions, clarifications.
It's almost, I do agree that the term, as we talk about vocab, the term militant, it does have that unfortunate connotation. And yes, I would say the property destruction, sure, you can see that they're trying to achieve their end through certain destructive means. But in some ways, their history of the suffragettes almost, to my mind, co-opts the term militant, that they use their hunger strike medals, for example, that they and the colors and use of banners, that they are very much engaging within the regalia of what you would see within like a typical military within, say, a nation, especially at the time. But they're using it to, in my mind, more constructive ends that they acknowledge in the same ways as you would a soldier. They're acknowledging those who have undergone tremendous hardship through force feeding while in prison as just recognition of their further acts towards the movement's eventual end, which was women's enfranchisement. So in that way, I see it as almost co-opting it for constructive ends. Instead, I would say like in a military end, say especially in terms of fighting a war, like your end is the destruction or the capitulation of your enemy. So you aim towards like a sole destructive end. Whereas for the suffragettes, their end was constructive and done within this done under similar, I would say, fronts, colors, and banners as a military, but they are seeking the right to vote. And so that almost seems more constructive than a destructive end that you would typically see within a militant type definition.
So they help to actually broaden the term to include constructive ends. And so, cool. Yeah, love it. I would also add that, the hunger strike medals to which you referred, they were distributed solely by the Women's Social and Political Union and not the Women's Freedom League. I'm a bit spotty on my Women's Freedom League history, I must say. And so I'm not aware if any members, I'm sure they did, engaged in hunger strikes. But in any case, if they did, to my knowledge, they didn't get, like the medals that you have seen, they were distributed by the Women's Social and Political Union. And the other thing I want to say about vocab is, this term suffragist, when we spoke to Elizabeth Crawford a few weeks ago, she used another term because there are suffragists in the United Kingdom. But they're called, and sometimes they use the term suffragist, but Elizabeth used the term constitutionalist, meaning we're like appealing to the Constitution and the words and speaking truth to power. And like, here's what the Constitution says. And, there are some acts of like engraving parts of the Constitution on the and so suffragist is also used in the UK, but it's used to denote those who are not militant. And so it's not really, quote, hardball if you're merely like making a plea or have a petition. It's not hardball enough. There needs to be, I interpret this as not so much like hardball, but skin in the game in terms of suffering. I would put it that way. And in any case, I'll stop there. So we got suffragist, which is not really hardball, but moral suasion, as Lucretia Mott would put it. You're just like trying to persuade their like rational faculty with argument. That's suffragist or constitutionalist, and you have suffragette, which is quote militant, but there are degrees of it, and the WSPU militancy was like too harsh for some women, and they broke away. They're still militant. They're still suffering. They're doing things like chaining themselves to grills in the House of Commons and waiting for the police to like saw off the grill, the gate, like that kind of stuff, but not destroying anything, not destroying property. I think that's an important distinction that I must say I did not appreciate until I sat down to do this show.
Same here. And just the sheer clarification you gain, it speaks to the power of knowing the nitty-gritty. It speaks to the power of getting clear on the vocab, and how, as you continue the process with care to penetrate into this history, that these types of distinctions become clear. Because same thing, that was that difference between suffragist and suffragette, and surely denoting the tactics or type of persuasion used was not one that I had been privy to previously. So many thanks, and always in sheer awe of the sheer complexity and detailed nature of the history, for sure.
Yes, indeed. You have to persist. I like how you use the word care, and I agree with that. And you have to like persist beyond these universal terms. And they always have nuances and subsets and subsets and subsets and exceptions to exceptions to exceptions. As a law student, you'll appreciate this. And so, yes, it's the same thing with like terms like suffragette, suffragist, militant. And this, as you know, as a student of philosophy as well, is really the legacy and of someone we call Socrates, who was very focused on getting clear on the nitty-gritty of universal concepts. So much so that they killed him for it. Well, anyway. All right. So let's look again at this founding document, which again is on the show resources page at virtuesofpeace.com. And let's talk about this spirit thing. We've talked about the nitty-gritty, and we've talked about suffragette, suffragist, militant, and so forth. If you're not clear on the distinctions, make sure to do your homework and get clear on the distinction between suffragist, suffragette, and degrees of militancy. Now, what about this spirit, the suffragette spirit? Okay, so this founding document says the whole purpose of the Suffragette Club, which is this. Do you agree, Michael, that suffragette and militant are synonymous?
Would the Women's Freedom League not consider themselves suffragette even though they're within the United Kingdom? Or would they, do you split the terminology? Because I would say my initial conceptualization was one purely of geography, that you have the difference between the United Kingdom and now the United States. Ist United States, United Kingdom, but now coming to have a more complex understanding that it also denotes tactics.
Yes.
That maybe the Women's Freedom League would identify themselves more with the term suffragist, is this appeal to moral persuasion over. See, so now my own personal
Good. No, I love it.
understanding.
So it's so useful. It's so useful. So indeed, I was confused. So this is why I had to, go to Elizabeth's grand book. And one thing that really helped me was knowing that this person, Edith Hal Martin, all right, who basically was like, I'm going to create this and she's using the phrase suffragette. She's a member of the Women's Freedom League, right? She calls it the Suffragette Club. Isn't that curious? But the other curious thing that really helped create a clearing for me is that she was, at a time, there were other people who served in this position, but the Women's Freedom League, in their organizational structure, had something called the, quote, political and militant section. So that was like a committee, if you will, or like what would you call it in political science, an organizational entity. Is there another word that I'm not thinking of?
Committee? Yeah, that would. Yeah, I think of the old legislature.
Office or office.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bureau.
So anyway, yeah, there you go. but the political and militant section, whatever that is, and again, follow the lead. But yeah, Edith Howe Martin was the head of the political and militant section, and so this militancy. I mean, I think suffragette. It's the militancy that begins in the UK, that then is transmitted to the US, but the US uses the term suffragist consciously and deliberately. I mean, that's the name of Alice Paul, the newsletter of the National Women's Party is called The Suffragist, which is in marked contrast to the newsletter of the Women's Social and Political Union, which is called The Suffragette. So the UK newsletter is called The Suffragette. The US newsletter is called The Suffragist. But I would say the US is using, quote, militant tactics, but those of the Women's Freedom League, not the Women's Social and Political Union, which is even all the more like, wow, because Alice Paul trained with the Women's Social and Political Union, and she's always linked to that. But as I read more and more about the Women's Freedom League, she's really getting a lot of tactics from the Women's Freedom League, Alice Paul is. I need to write a paper on that, or something. But yeah, so militant just means like hardball, no matter where you are, but there are degrees of it. And as long as you're doing some sort of hardball, which I would say the other side of that is voluntary suffering, that's a suffragette. Does that help?
Absolutely. And I would say then, given that the Women's Freedom League broke off from the Women's Social Political Union, this is just me purely speculating, but I could imagine some act of, if you have always identified with this term, maybe you still, that it speaks to a higher relation or a higher ideal of just pursuing women's enfranchisement. And so I identify with this term. This term describes me because this is the end I'm working towards. And I don't want to give up something that I personally find very reaffirming of my own identity and autonomy. I'm simply going to go about achieving this end denoted by the term suffragette in a less militant way. Or maybe there is a shift and then you do identify with the ist because it greater matches, it speaks more to you. So, but same thing, her intentional usage of the term, I think, speaks to its power to denote the overall history within the United Kingdom.
Yeah, because that's really where it begins. And importantly, Alice Paul, and this is a story that's lost on many people, and that's why, as you know, Michael, I did recreate the Hunger Strike medal, the WSPU version, but I also created ex nihilo, a medal for Alice Paul. She never received a Hunger Strike medal proper from the WSPO, nor did the National Women's Party distribute Hunger Strike medals, because really only like 2 people, Alice Paul being one of them, engaged in hunger strikes and were forcibly fed in the United States, whereas in the United Kingdom, so many more women.
Mm-hmm.
And Alice Paul was forcibly fed on 2 continents. One, the United Kingdom, when she's working for the WSPU, and then in the United States after she forms the National Women's Party. But really, like, this whole spirit, if you will, the suffragette spirit, which we're trying to talk about it, starts in England. Okay. And it's named in England, and it's named in this document on our show resource page. And we're trying to get clear on what that is. So again, Edith Howe Martin says it's a very real thing that is a, quote, spirit of joyful sacrifice, okay, that expressed itself in deeds of daring and which accepted unpopularity, hardships, and misunderstanding, confident in its power to give all to win success for the cause. So joyful sacrifice. So this notion of like sacrifice and hardship, I would say, are essential to this. They're necessary attributes of the suffragette spirit. I'll stop and see if you want to add anything, Mike.
Personally say in having gone through the microfilms and coming across various documents, one in particular, as we had mentioned earlier, Kitty Marion's autobiography that she is writing. Her dates are 1871 to 1944. She's initially German before coming to the United Kingdom, engaged in the suffragette movement before World War One. Given that she's German and if unknown, World War One is fought between the Central Powers, being Germany and at the time Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, and then the Entente, which is the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and then later on, beginning in 1917, the United States. So there's this prevailing anti-German sentiment, and she leaves in 1915, thereabout, and comes to the United States, and that's where she remains. She may be known by anyone, maybe from her activism within women's contraception, but she remained a tour de force for the remainder of her life. Incredibly fascinating character. And so this aspect of joyful sacrifice is reflected within her writings of the time of being imprisoned. And one in particular that had stuck out to me is she writes, quote, this is when she's in prison. Like oasis in the wilderness, I had my perfectly peaceful, happy moments alone in my cell, reading, thinking, and listening to the still small voice, unquote. I personally was very struck by that in the sense, while she is in prison and while she is being force-fed, that she consciously recognizes years later, over a decade later, that there were these moments where she was able to engage in introspection and reflection and find joy within her own suffering, the suffering being that she was in prison. I also like to point out, still small voice is Quaker language. I know that ties into peace history immensely. It's kind of a reflection of inner voice, but then also possibly God. So I had found that to be that was a really cool connection there too.
Yes, that's lovely. And the still small voice, we could call it God, we could call it the inner light, we could call it the voice of reason, we could call it the conscience. And by the way, conscience in action was Kim Dae-jung's nickname, and it's the name of our memory parlor this year. conscienceinaction.com, check it out. But she says she's reading. Now, did you happen to see what she was reading?
One text that she particularly points to. She made sure that her presence in prison was known. So in the same passages, I know from her writings at least, that they at least had access to the Bible. And so she describes one instance in which she has a desire to start a fire in her cell so that they will come in. The context is lost on me in the pages that I've had, but she describes how so what is she going to use to start the fire? She has access to a mattress that's in the cell. She has this Bible, and there's lights that are fed by gas that remain constantly on. So that's her fuel source. And so the mattress she describes is being made of this canvas material, so rather tough. So she can't directly cause the mattress to go up in flames. So she needs this intermediary incendiary object. And so she describes tearing out Bible pages to stuff into the mattress and then since those would catch fire first, to then set the whole mattress ablaze. And so there's this really incredible moment where she's reflecting on this, and she writes, quote, was I justified in using what I needed, which were the Bible pages, for that in our fight for freedom and justice? And then she says, God's words stand for both, meaning freedom and justice, and a replaceable paper copy could not be used in a better cause.
Cool. So it was one of a kind, different issue. That's really cool. And what's so interesting is, you mentioned the Bible, and another thing that the suffragettes were reading in prison thanks to Emmeline Pethick Lawrence, was Olive Schreiner. And I don't know, like Kitty Marion must have known Olive Schreiner. I mean, I would love to find a reel where she's like, I was reading, or Olive Schreiner was being read aloud, because sometimes Olive Schreiner was read aloud. That's how I learned about Olive Schreiner, was through Constance Lytton's autobiography, Prisons and Prisoners. But, Olive Schreiner has several, what she calls, what are they called? Not analogs. It starts with an A. Anyway, it doesn't matter.
Anthologies?
No, it's not anthology. It's like a parable. But in any case, she has several of them which talk about the necessity of suffering for wisdom. And actually, one of them, called The Hunter, is the one that was read aloud when Olive Schreiner is read aloud to Howard Thurman. It's called Allegory. That's what it's called, Allegory. The Hunter is read aloud, and it's all about how the only way to any kind of wisdom and truth is suffering. And so there's several allegories where she speaks this way. And this, helps to reframe suffering. That instead of like, oh my God, this is terrible, that this is for the sake of this cause, but also like a deeper wisdom. And that was being read aloud in the prisons, as Constance Lytton reports in her Prisons and Prisoners book. And Constance Lytton Olive Schreiner looked at Constance Lytton as a model of humanity, both the best brain and heart. Like, it's just fully both, like, male brain and female compassion are at their fullest blossom in the character of Constance Lytton, says Olive Schreiner. So those narratives were around. You have like the still small voice of the conscience, informed by the Bible and Olive Schreiner. And, what's interesting is Olive Schreiner was very critical of Christianity because of its failure to include animals in its view of the divine. And what's so interesting is that the Women's Freedom League, if you look up the Minerva Club, I mean, these were also vegetarians. And so this whole like Minerva Club was this like progressive thought which included vegetarianism, women's enfranchisement, all these sort of like progressive causes. And so, conversation for another day, I'm sure. But going back to the spirit, so it's this thing, as you're adding to this understanding with the Kitty Marion piece. So it's this thing inside of you that it is able to give you solace in what people would perceive to be a difficult situation.
From my conceptualization, absolutely. And I would also go further in, I think, so you have this piece of being able to endure, but then I think it naturally raises the question, well, how are you able to do that? I think, it speaks to their incredible moral fortitude within, that this is something they can withstand. But I think what is a key component of this spirit as well is that none of them are doing this alone. Sure, they're alone in the sense of they're in their own cell, they're being force-fed, but there is this great overriding characteristic of fellowship itself, of friendship, and of deep care and respect and love for the women that they're undergoing their fight for enfranchisement with. And that has always been something that I have found so incredibly inspiring about this movement, is that these women greatly cared for one another and their well-being. And I mean, that is reflected in their communications with each other. In her autobiography, once Kitty Marion is released from prison under the Cat and Mouse Act after being force-fed, She describes how she's losing weight, and so she has to be released so that she can be cared for, which totally ties into Nurse Pine's actions. But Constance Lytton writes to Kitty Marion, and Kitty Marion puts part of the letter in her autobiography, and she quotes Constance Lytton as writing to Kitty Marion as, quote, "I do not know what to say to you. My reverence for you is of the greatest, and I feel a love for you which I cannot put on paper. I have thought of you incessantly while you were being forcibly fed. Your splendid courage is greater than anything I can conceive. But you are free. Oh, what men and women will bless you. The women deep down in their hearts, wronged, oppressed, and divided. Always yours truly and reverently, Constance Lytton." So, I mean,
That's really cool.
unquote, it just sums it up right there that they have, that it just comes forth naturally, and there is no pretense of hierarchy in their interactions, or of ego, or of prestige that would place one individual above another, that they truly, from passages such as this and the spirit itself, seem linked arm in arm in this struggle, and that it's just what holds that bond together is this sense of overriding fellowship, which is so incredibly inspiring and heartfelt.
Right. So we understand a little bit better the word suffragette, and we understand a little bit better the word fellowship, Suffragette Fellowship. And fellowship, right, it's just this like love and bond of friendship without hierarchy. I love that. I think that's so, I'm clapping and yes, yay. Right. It's not about hierarchy. It's about unity, which was, by the way, the name of our memory parlor last year, Toward Unity. It's about, being united in this cause of not only, and here we get to like Edith Howe Martin, and P.S., like Edith Howe Martin also worked on birth control. And so if you're interested in like the Edith Howe Martin, Kitty Marion, Margaret Sanger, birth control, like go down the rabbit hole and then look up the Suffragette Fellowship collection on microfilm. But it's this commitment to each other and also to future generations, which is why Edith Howe Martin is like, we have to transmit this spirit to future generations. And so let me create the Suffragette Club. And again, this is the founding document. Without the microfilms, we would not know it. Without the microfilms, you probably wouldn't know Kitty Marion, Michael. And so she does that. So this is fellowship for, those who are taking on the hardship, but also thinking also of future generations, fellowship with them and like passing this valuable heritage on to them. I'll stop and see if you want to add anything.
I think that totally gets at the suffragette spirit as well, that the history and their work itself is a live thing, that the spirit is a live thing, that it's there, and one can more easily come into contact and enter into dialogue with it through encountering this history, going into the microfilms, seeing the physical manifestations of their work. And that in terms, the hope is that it informs your own actions in the present day, especially in a time of a great political tumult, not only in the United States, but globally, that there's much to be learned from from these women and what they were doing at this time to tackle their own various issues and adversities we face today.
Indeed. And yes, so in this founding document, you have this explicit language where she says the purpose of this suffragette club is to enshrine the suffragette spirit, and then, quote, to keep in mind for future generations of women the history, the achievements, the heroisms, and some understanding of the most remarkable phase and the struggle for women's emancipation, end of quote. So that's direct language from Edith Howe Martin's document, again on our show resources page. Reel 2 frames 78, 79 in the microfilm. I should also say that like there is the actual collection. So there's like the stuff that was microfilmed, but then there's like actual like books, papers, and stuff held by the Museum of London, which according to Elizabeth Crawford is closed right now for renovations. um, so you can't right now interact directly with the collection. The best you can do, if you can, is look at the microfilms. Cool. So the other passage or direct thing from this founding document, she goes on to say, Edith Howe Martin goes on to say, quote, "A worthy memorial of this kind can only be created by the suffragette spirit, and whether it takes concrete shape will depend on the support they feel inclined to give it." I think this is a very philosophical claim because can only be created by the suffragette spirit. A worthy memorial of this kind can only be created by that specific spirit of, again, like fellowship and putting skin in the game, enduring hardship and suffering, but not in a way that involves any sort of like hierarchy or ego, as you said, Michael. So you want to add anything to that?
Especially to that quote, I love the last bit of that when it says, will depend on the support they feel inclined to give it. Meaning that the spirit's permanence does not depend on these continued physical manifestations, that it's always there. And it is only, and if you seek that type of end of some concrete entity, that it will only come through a genuine connection with it and being moved by the spirit. Like it doesn't ask, like it just exists. It just is. And it's in its very nature, it will only manifest itself in, say, that material memorial way by those who feel inclined to do so. And by those who feel the need to tap into it, that it's always there. And that speaks to, I would say, one's own duty and the way in which one orients themselves to where would you come into contact with this? How would you? What is your overall normative framework that would then make you receptive to something like this that then would cause you to move?
Right. And maybe the normative framework is necessary for a right proper interaction with the quote spirit, but it's not sufficient. In other words, like just because you have the like right framework does not mean that you're going to be moved by it. That could be. That's a question for another show, maybe. But no, I love that. And, as you know, on this show, we've talked about another spirit called the spirit of history, which is a term that John Lewis uses, the late, great John Lewis. And he says, like what you're talking about, Michael, that this is a real thing. He says this in his book, Walking with the Wind, that like he could feel it, and he could feel it like acting through him. And he said, you can call it what you want, but there's like, this is part of the architecture of the universe, that there are these forces out there, and they're at work. And so suffragette spirit is, one thing that I asked is like, is that the same thing as the spirit of history? I think it's a very specific fork, if you will, in the world spirit. But right, it doesn't depend on you. It's there. I love that. And like the extent to which you see it or hear it, like the normative framework that you have is will play a role into the reception of it. But I don't think it's sufficient. I think it's necessary, and it may not be necessary. Actually, it may not be necessary. It's a factor that I think is linked to a higher degree of likelihood that you're going to be impacted. But I don't think it's either necessary nor sufficient. Yeah. Because if it is necessary, then that's not very hopeful for folk, because they may not be exposed to such a normative framework. And maybe it's just something like inside everybody, like the conscience, which they choose to hear. And I've been working with this quote from Immanuel Kant of late, which is on the nursepinemedal.com website, which says something like, the only duty that we have is to remove the obstacles of the conscience and to create all the conditions that allow a greater hearing of it. It's on the nursepinemedal.com page from Immanuel Kant, which today is not only the 125th anniversary of the 1899 Hague Peace Conference beginning May 18th, 1899, but we are also in the 300th year of the birth of Immanuel Kant, who was born in April, so like last month, 1724. So only connect. There's a spirit. That's the spirit of history. Now, what's so interesting, and we're like coming to the end because we've been going for a little bit over an hour, so we'll try to wind it down if we can. But and maybe I'll loop this in to the post-production. But the Women's Freedom League and Edith Howe Martin, they're pretty much erased from our conscience. And this whole like effort at memory work here. And again, we got here because Nurse Pine is leaving her books and photographs to this entity that Edith Howe Martin creates. But Nurse Pine calls it by a different name. And it wasn't until Elizabeth Crawford clarified, no, this is the Suffragette Fellowship. And that just opened up a whole, wow, like she's leaving it to the Suffragette Fellowship. Now, what that is, we've been trying to talk about, but the Women's Freedom League is pretty much erased. And it wasn't until September of this year. 2023. So not a long time ago, that a, quote, blue plaque was installed at the premises of the Women's Freedom League, and Elizabeth Crawford was there, and she unveiled it, and this is just 2023 that this blue plaque is going up. Now, in the United States, these blue historical markers are called Pomeroy markers. And you see them all over historical cities like Philadelphia and Boston and so forth. But and these are like markers. So-and-so lived here. So-and-so, this thing happened here. And Michael, I know you've been to Philadelphia and you've seen those, quote, Pomeroy markers. But do you agree, like, there's not a lot of those where we are?
No, one might describe them as a dead zone.
Right. There's really not a lot of memory work in our parts being done. And this is a point that you made also when we were in Philadelphia, because there's a whole cult of personality in Philadelphia around William Penn. And you made this point, like, there's no like personality or person whose deeds of daring help us to understand Michigan. So 2 points here. Like, one is the excavation on like the being present to the consciousness or public conscience, whatever you want, in London about the Women's Freedom League doesn't start until September of 2023, when a blue, like, that's a physical, visible thing that is going to allow people to enter the forest in a much more easy way. Like, oh, what's this? And hopefully they say, oh, what's the Women's Freedom League? And they can go research it and so forth. And so it's not until those barriers are lowered, like September of 2023 for the Women's Freedom League. So I don't know if you want to comment on that, Michael, or like this Pomeroy marker impoverishment that we suffer here in Michigan.
Yes, having witnessed the Pomeroy marker impoverishment firsthand. But if anything, I would say, exactly to your point, if it takes until less than a year ago from the recording of this show for the blue Pomeroy marker, or the equivalent blue plaque to go up for the Women's Freedom League.
They call it blue plaque in England.
Yeah, the blue plaque. That gives us great hope for, say, in the state of Michigan for the emergence of various Palmyra markers. And I would say it speaks to not the lack of there being these morally substantive individuals and morally substantive history. It just speaks to a lack of the work that has been done in excavating them. But it takes the excavation work to begin to even determine whether there are these morally substantive stories there. Like, what is the vein? Maybe in places such as the United Kingdom and Philadelphia, it's just like a far richer vein to be tapped into, and it has bountiful resources in terms of individuals and stories. And maybe the vein is less so in the state of Michigan or elsewhere. Not that I would necessarily think it is. There's some pretty cool people who have come out of the state of Michigan, for sure. And just in terms of pop culture alone. Madonna, Diana Ross, but I digress. That in terms of history, that
Eminem. Sorry.
Yeah, exactly. Eminem. See, that it just speaks to that a sign of the impoverishment is a sign of the work that needs to be done. And it speaks to, it's very hopeful in the sense that it could just be maybe a plethora that remains to be discovered. And having seen many nodes along the red thread in the spirit of history, that oddly are far more interconnected than you would ever assume. So who knows? You may find in such work in, say, a place like Michigan or in Arkansas or elsewhere, places that you wouldn't necessarily associate in comparison to the coasts. You may even find suffragette connections or suffragist connections that you wouldn't even assume. And then when you encounter it, you say, well, of course, it was there all along. It doesn't ask for your permission. It just is waiting to be discovered.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And actually, in prep for this show, I was reading something called Conversations with Alice Paul, where Amelia Fry sits down with Alice Paul at the end of her life and just has a dialogue with her. And you can read this online. It's amazing. And Amelia Fry is asking her about her time in England. I was like, did she know about the Women's Freedom League? That's what I was looking up, and I didn't see anything yet. But she's reading to jog Alice Paul's memory. She's reading from Sylvia Pankhurst's book on the movement, and she mentions Christabel. So there are these sisters. There's Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters, and Christabel actually died in California. And so Amelia Fry is like, I'm reading Sylvia, and Alice Paul is like, oh yeah, this is a speech from Christabel, and she was so good. And Amelia goes, well, she died in the United States in California. Did you ever get to see her? And Alice Paul is like, no, I have so many regrets. I should have. She was there, and she was right here. So who knew that Christabel Pankhurst would die in California? So there's stuff there. But the other thing that I want to say is that I learned from you, Michael, that today, so when we're talking about positive history, this is really important. We're not just talking about people. We're also talking about events. And I learned from you that today, correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't something having to do with the death penalty happen on May 18th in Michigan? Am I wrong?
Yes. No, right. You are not wrong. Today, that's a talk about peace history as a side tangent. Michigan, the entity itself, the state, is the oldest, is my understanding, the oldest Anglo-Saxon sovereign entity to have abolished the death penalty. On May 18th, 1846, the Michigan legislature passed the law stating that there shall be no death penalty, and it entered into force March 1st, 1847. That connects global peace history.
That's just nuts.
Yeah. Because, see, it's right there. May 18th, today, 125th anniversary of the opening of the 1899 Hague Peace Conference. March 1st, 1847, the law enters into effect. In terms of Korean peace history, March 1st, 1919 is famously the March 1st movement. And so there are these, that the dates align, that the interconnectedness is sheer complexity and ability to inspire is endless. And there, I think that's an excellent thing for you to have brought up that. There we go.
Yes.
There's Michigan's contribution.
Yeah, we're literally sitting in it. Now, back to
Yeah.
Nurse Pine and her bequest. So we're closing out the show now, and again, like, we got here because we were looking at this suffragette memorabilia provision of Nurse Catherine Pine's last will and testament, and as we said, there was this blog post. We said it in our show in April. Elizabeth Crawford wrote a blog post called "The Mystery of Nurse Pine's Medal Solved." And since then, there has been some news about Nurse Pine's medal. That is, the mystery, it's a multidimensional. Part of it has been solved. But again, it's like this, going back to this, like, care of making things apparent to the consciousness. I mean, Elizabeth Crawford digging up wills, reading them, and reporting on them. I just think that's care. I don't think it's simple curiosity. There's a kind of, like, real, commitment to that I think speaks of care. And that care has brought that to our consciousness. And Michael, because you've been with this story of Nurse Pine's medal for some years now. Now, Nurse Pine, in this provision of her will, does leave her books and photographs to this Suffragette Fellowship Club collection. But it's also important, and it's on our show resources page, that when she's alive, she donates to it a cup used by Emmeline Pankhurst in prison. So I just want to give a shout out to Nurse Catherine Pine for both, while she's living, contributing to this thing, and while she's dying and dead, contributing to this thing. Because that act has really impacted my behavior, Elizabeth's behavior, and it has caused me to acquire Nurse Pine's suffragette medal, which came up for auction on April 27th of this year. And I'm going to open the lid. I'm looking at it right now. Okay. And in terms of dates, Michael, you said, like, these dates, it's just 11 dates. And going into it is just other treasure trove of, like, understanding the contours of this suffragette spirit, as we've been talking about. Now, I will end, and then we'll just have final summation remarks by, again, Elizabeth Crawford's excellent book, Reference Guide. If you read the entry on Edith Howe Martin, you will also learn that upon her death, she bequeaths, and she dies in 1954. So she bequeaths the residue of her estate to the Suffragette Fellowship. So, like, she begins it, like, we need to start collecting the stuff, transmit it, and when she dies, she's like, everything that's left over is going to go to that cause. And she dies in 1954, and as we said, by 1951, the London Museum has taken over the collection. And so one question is, like, what does she see her, because she sees, like, it's going to the museum now, and so what work can her money do? And I think that it's probably used to publish the newsletter, Calling All Women, which its last issue was in the 1970s. But here we are. We find ourselves with that today, and so one of the working titles of this show was from one will to another, meaning from Nurse Pine's will to Edith Howe Martin's will, and how all these two wills are being used to contribute to this memory work, which really has to do with, like, putting these stories in front of us in a very real way. So I'll stop and see, Michael, if you have anything to add and or closing comments.
I would say first, just when you had mentioned Nurse Pine's contribution to this movement posthumously, I certainly, not nearly to the same grandiose extent, but on a smaller scale, dialogue between two individuals. What we're doing right now on this history is certainly in contribution to keeping its memory alive, and certainly on your behalf acquiring Nurse Pine's medal, which is just beyond incredible, and the moral force which will come forth from that remains to be fully realized. It will unspool as time goes on. I would say on a personal level, something that has always struck me about engaging with this is just the sheer power that this history has to inspire and to shape action and to really reinforce the idea that nothing is truly ever done alone. Even if it's not with another living individual, you're not alone in the sense that you're learning from people from the past. And I will close by quoting one of my absolute favorite marks from Kitty Marion's autobiography that she writes. She writes this in the point in her life, as she's recollecting on it all, she's about to leave the United Kingdom for the United States after World War I has begun. Reminder, she's leaving because she is German and anti-German sentiment is very prevalent, and one of the possibilities is she would be deported back to Germany. So she makes the go-ahead to leave for the United States. And as she reflects back on the war and on her time in the suffragette movement, she writes, quote, "Blood is thicker than water. I heard many times quoted extensively during the war, but always found the spirit, there it is, of friendship, love, justice, truth, and so forth, thicker, stronger, and more sustaining than blood," which I think is just to further heap on to our understanding of suffragette spirit and the term spirit itself within this context, and just speaks to the power that comes from doing this work, but then also in knowing that you are not alone in doing it. Non tibi hoc soli, you are not alone.
Well said. That's beautiful. And I will add also to this non tibi hoc soli, you are not alone. And it's Hannah Arendt again, talks about, she calls it the 2-in-1. We're really like, there's two beings inside our head. There's the still small voice of the conscience, if you will, and it's separate. It's separate. There's like a dialogue that you can have with yourself. And Hannah Arendt's incredible reading of Plato and Socrates is, and these passages where Socrates says, "I would rather be out of tune with everybody else than be out of tune with myself." And this whole idea of like justice as harmony of the soul, and it has something to do with like being in proper alignment with yourself, so that, as Hannah Arendt puts it, you're like actually friends with yourself, and you like to go home to yourself, because in the end you have to go home to yourself. And if you're like a murderer, as Hannah Arendt, like, you don't want to go home to yourself. It's not fun in there. And I just think that's so, like, the you're not alone. There's also this like other thing in you, which Kant says this is our duty to like make it heard, remove the obstacles so that you can hear it properly. I love that. And anyway, I think it's a right, proper way to close out the show, which has been focused on the suffragette spirit. So yeah, we've been going for about 90 minutes, a little bit over, so I think it is time to end this session. And so thank you very much, Michael, for being here on May 18th, 2024, the 4-year anniversary of the Virtues of Peace podcast, the 125th anniversary of the Hague Peace Conference, some anniversary of the proposal for the death penalty in the state of Michigan, and the Gwangju massacre, and many other things. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. Truly a pleasure, as always.
Right. So check out our show resources page, and that's a wrap. Thank you.